Hi, everybody. I'm Elizabeth Wilkins, President and CEO of the Roosevelt Institute, and I am delighted to be here today with some big news and a very special guest. I am thrilled to announce that Nobel Prize winning economist Paul Krugman will be joining the Roosevelt Institute as a senior fellow. Paul is one of the world's most cited economists and widely read commentators, and for good reason. His longtime Times column and his Substack now prove that he is not just a bold thinker. He is one of the clearest and most dynamic communicators in the field. Skills that come in handy when you want to break through the noise of this moment and get people thinking about what the future of our economy and democracy might look like. And of course, this is what Roosevelt is all about, understanding where we are in the moment and where we need to go. So, Paul, I'm so excited to talk with you today. I started at Roosevelt in February, so we're kind of both new kids on the block here. And I will start with a question that I am getting a lot recently. Why your interest in affiliating with Roosevelt and why now?
Well, I think because partly having retired from the New York Times, I'm free to pursue other affiliations. The Times is kind of a jealous organization, but now that I'm no longer there, I can do this. And look, Roosevelt has been a tremendous reservoir of progressive thinking, progressive economics. I was heavily reliant on Roosevelt research particularly during the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis. I've been around for a while here, and we're still we're still novel stuff going on, and this seemed like a good affiliation to have in these times, and join the ranks of people with Roosevelt affiliations who have been providing really urgent commentary.
Well, thank you for the kind words. We appreciate it. Um, One of the things that made your Times column such a hit for decades was kind of the unique voice that you bring to economics, your ability to break down orthodoxy and kind of cut to the core of what's happening in sort of plain terms, I think. It almost goes without saying that there is a lot to cut through right now. We've seen attacks on government programs, whole government agencies. And, as you have noted, and I have noted, the fate of Social Security and our real sort of social compact hangs in the balance right now. So, can you talk with a little bit of your perspective on economic history about what you think makes this moment unique and through all this noise, what people should be paying attention to and why?
We've lived since the New Deal in a whatever you want to call it, the Keynesian consensus thing. We've lived in a world where we by no means went to socialism, but we had capitalism with some of the rough edges sanded off. Not as many of the rough edges as I would like, but we have Social Security. We've had Medicare since the 60s. We've had Medicaid. We have the Affordable Care Act. We have a whole bunch of social insurance programs. We have um, government efforts to at least somewhat regulate the excesses and harms of markets. And now, for some reason, we are, I have some theories, but anyway, we are at a moment where there's a real possibility that we may really lose that we're talking about possible retrogression. And at the same time, the possibility of moving forward after this current moment is past, perhaps. But we really are at a point where the certainties of the underlying continuity of a fairly decent social compact is at risk. And so this is really new.
I really like that phrase, this sort of capitalism with the rough edges sanded off. And what I'm hearing you say is basically the idea of the social compact is that, yes, we have capitalism, but we also have a commitment to providing a measure of security for people, and that's kind of the deal we have struck. You write a ton about the New Deal and FDR. Can you just expand a little bit about how to think about that trade-off, how long that consensus has held, and if there are any other moments in our economic history um, where there have been similar threats to that compact that we can learn from?
Okay, so I mean, I like to think it's 1933, and the world economy has collapsed. A lot of reasonable people have concluded that capitalism is irredeemable and can't be saved. And then on the other hand, you have a lot of forces of repression out there. And along comes, in several countries, the US in some ways leading the kind of New Deal order, which says, no, we know we're not actually going to go socialist. We're not going to seize the commanding heights of production, but we are going to try to make sure that extreme hardship is banished as far as we can manage. We're going to try to make sure that workers feel they have rights and claims on the system. And so, yeah, the Roosevelt Institute. But very much this moment when we reached a kind of um, I don't know if it's a compromise or a synthesis, but the idea of the basic standard of decency, the four freedoms, while at the same time not saying that it's not evil to make profits, it's not evil to be personally ambitious, but we are going to try to make it so that everyone shares in the gains from economic activity. And that really held. I mean, there was a moment when the Reagan administration came in. There was clearly that represented in many ways a turn away from that New Deal consensus, but not to the extent that we have now. And so we moments of economic stress, people tend to say, well, maybe this thing doesn't work anymore. The 1970s with stagflation, the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis, but pretty much it has basically been the case that attempts to turn away from that basic structure, and which in the US context have always meant a turn to the right. But in principle, you could imagine a turn to the left, but that hasn't ever really happened in this country. Until right now, it has always seemed that the public wouldn't stand for it. When push came to shove, when George W. Bush tried to privatize Social Security, it was a sort of resounding, no, you don't. We love Social Security. But the possibility that we will have either explicitly or de facto undermining of those institutions seems much higher right now, just because we live in such, well, we're not going to talk about the politics particularly, but the possibility that we'll lose it. And the one thing that I would say is that I think there's political action by itself, but there's also the importance of getting the facts clear, getting the way the world works clear. No, there are not 10 million dead people receiving Social Security benefits. No, tax cuts and deregulation are not the only way to achieve economic growth. So these are really critical things. Facts matter, analysis matters.
I'm just going to pick up on that last thing you said about facts matter, analysis matters, and maybe go a little bit towards your true economist side. It's not just Social Security we're talking about, as you know, and you
Right.
just mentioned, we're in the middle of a tax and budget fight,
Yeah.
where very much we are looking at a situation where tax cuts for the wealthy might be traded for cuts to the programs that are specifically for our most vulnerable, like Medicaid and SNAP. This obviously has both kind of political economy and democratic implications. It also has economic implications. Can you talk a little bit about this idea of what it means, this kind of wealth transfer, frankly, from the poorest to the richest, both in terms of hard facts, economics, and growth, and in terms of the social compact that we've been talking about?
One of the revelations, really, I've spent decades now following this stuff, and it's become increasingly clear that taking care of the most vulnerable members of society means something you should do. It's a moral obligation. But it's also good economics, especially, by the way, of children. I mean, if you ask, a dollar spent on ensuring adequate healthcare and nutrition for children clearly pays off with multiple dollars of economic performance, because those children grow up to be more productive adults. And so this is one of those things where, even if you think that uh, one way to say this is that I'd say that conservative economic doctrine is all about uh, uh, punishing. It's all about incentives. Poverty should be painful and wealth should be glorious. And what that all misses is the importance of just plain resources. That if low income families cannot devote the resources to their children that you need to make those children fully productive adults. Some will manage despite that, but just plain making sure that everybody in the country has the resources to make the most of themselves and their children is a enormously practical thing. It's not just soft-hearted liberal talk, though I am a soft-hearted liberal, but it's also just what you need to do if you want to make the most of your country's potential.
I'm going to take another policy area, one actually that you know a lot about. It's the area of focus that won you your Nobel Prize.
Yeah.
You in recent months have been saying that one of the biggest risks of the Trump administration's economic agenda is their chaotic tariff policy. We are currently recording the day after Liberation Day.
Yeah.
And last year, you predicted that the cronyism of those tariffs might be the biggest story in the long run, in addition to the chaos. So, can you kind of walk us through those risks, the chaos and the cronyism, and to what degree you're seeing that play out for American workers and consumers? And, why? I mean, there's a lot of reasons why, but why are these tariffs different than the years that we've seen them in the past?
So the first thing to say is, look, there's a standard uh, economics case against tariffs, which is that it basically leads your economy to uh, turn away from the things it's really good at and start doing the things that it's not especially good at. So, if in my example, in New York, there's lots of memories of the garment industry. But we really don't want to bring the garment industry back. Those were pretty bad jobs, and it happens to be stuff that can be done. Um, they can do it reasonably well in Bangladesh, which desperately needs that industry, and we should be doing the things that we're really good at instead. So that's the classic case. What we're discovering is that the rise of this hostility towards trade has additional costs. And the most immediate one is just plain that we don't know what it's going to be. As you say, we're recording this the day after Liberation Day, and which nobody knows. I have to say that the actual tariff announcement shocked a lot of people because it was both much bigger and much more um, kind of arbitrary than people expected. I wouldn't have been really shocked if there was a 15% across the board tariff, because that had been kind of um, foreshadowed. But instead, this different tariffs for every country and the use of this wasn't really on anybody's playbook. And nobody knows whether it persists. And just for once, think of yourself as being well, first of all, think of yourself as being a business person trying to make decisions. You're going to make an investment in your business, or are you? I mean, should you be spending money, making commitments on the basis that, okay, we're going to have 20% tariffs on all goods from Europe, or should you make it on the proposition that, look, that's crazy, those won't last? And both of those are defensible propositions. Anything you do, if you if you invest on the assumption that the tariffs are here to stay, then you'll be have made a terrible decision if they don't. And if you see so there's a lot of paralysis that comes from the chaos. It really is. I've always been skeptical of people who invoke uncertainty as a reason that policy is holding the economy back, because it's often used as an argument against progressive policies. Oh, your universal health care goals, that creates uncertainty. But in this case, this really is a major harmful issue. We have not yet seen the cronyism, but it's clearly potential. The whole root of the reason why trade is where the dramatic stuff is happening. There is stuff happening elsewhere, but the U.S. law creates a lot of discretion for the executive branch in tariff setting. Tariffs were only supposed to be applied for as remedies for specific kinds of shocks or specific kinds of threats, but the decision about whether those conditions apply lies with the executive branch. So a president who wants to can do whatever they want on trade. And in the past, that's always been held back by uh, concern about how will other countries react. What about the system? We built this global trading system, so it's always been assumed that the president would have a wider view. But if you take that away, then it's not just arbitrary in terms of what are the overall levels of tariffs, it's who gets a tariff break. And it is entirely possible to, in fact, every time we do impose tariffs, there tend to be some exemptions. There are good reasons why sometimes you might want to exempt somebody from a tariff, but if it's all arbitrary, well, the exemption might come because you go golfing with the president or something like that. And so that creates a lot of problematic uh, incentives. We actually saw that in 2017, 2018, when the US was putting on the tariffs, which look trivial compared with what's now on the plate. But it was very clear that um, uh, industries and companies that were politically tied to the administration in power were much more likely to get exemptions than those that weren't. So we actually saw this. Now it was uh, everything. We live in amazing times, and I mean that in the worst way. But it's everything that happened on the first go round of what we called a trade war, but it was really nothing. It was a skirmish compared with what's happening now. But now the possibilities are huge. And look, there's a whole field of economic research on what the field calls rent seeking, on economies where the way to succeed in business is not to be good at business, but to be good at cultivating political connections. And much of that actually was about tariffs and import quotas, but typically in developing countries. So that there was a large concern that in places like Brazil or India, you were actually sacrificing a lot of potential gainful economic activity because businesses were focused instead on currying political favor. Well, could that happen here? Yes, it could. Very much, very much, down the road. I mean, I have to say that the speed and scale of the stuff that's going on makes me think that we may have a global trade war and massive disruption before we even get around, before we get around to the cronyism. But it's down there. It's in there. It's in the mix.
Yeah. Well, and we have seen before yesterday a real stop start, put on, put off.
Yeah.
Someone complains and we delay for a month. So I think we'll really have to see post yesterday kind of where this goes, and this is a helpful roadmap for what to look for.
Yeah, and we should bear in mind that the rest of the world has agency too. And part of the issue here is that um, the the chaotic nature of the rollout is, again, the rest of the world has agency. And if you want to avoid getting into a lot of tit for tat, you probably want to at least kind of explain what you're doing and not be offending other countries unnecessarily. But of course, we are doing that. So, I mean, to make Canada turn anti-American really takes. I didn't think that was. I wasn't. That wasn't on my dance card for my career.
Roosevelt has argued for a long time for the sort of strategic and targeted use of tariffs alongside industrial policy, and also, of course, alongside a strong sense of um, what rules and regulations you have to use to control, unproductive uses of corporate and market power in that context, to make sure that the incentive structure that you're creating um, actually targets the gains that you're trying to make. But we've also argued for a way to transition into those things that takes account of some of the concerns that you've raised in terms of creating a stable business environment for investment, creating predictability, explaining things to sort of mitigate the risk of fallout. And we've heard members of the administration say, hey, yes, admit that this is going to be a little bit painful for a while, but it'll be beneficial in the end. You started to say this, but can you just pick apart for us when we hear someone say, yeah, there might be a little bit of turmoil for a while. What are the real costs of what that kind of turmoil might be for businesses, workers, consumers?
Well, I actually don't buy. I mean, yes, there's short-term pain, but it's not short-term pain in exchange for long-run gain. By any economic model I can think of applying, it's actually short-term pain in return for probably even bigger long-term pain. I mean, the story about how this gets better is really not there. I mean, but look, I'm not a purist free trader. I'm not a laissez-faire guy. I mean, there's a kind of idealized version of the sort of post New Deal consensus, which is leave economic activity up to the markets, and then we'll have a social safety net. But that has never been enough. We always need some additional stuff. We always need some industrial policy, and I think we needed more than we have actually had. The reality is that you still want to have a lot of the international trade has, for the most part, been a plus for the U.S. economy. There are distributional issues, but even there has probably been a net plus for the great majority of workers. And you want to mitigate the parts that aren't. So the idea that shutting it down is going to produce a better outcome 5, 10 years down the pike, there's really no clear argument to that effect. What is true is that we have this additional overlay, which is that nobody knows what the world is going to look like next year. And so this is a tremendous inhibiting force. So this could, normally when people say that, well, protectionism causes recessions, my answer has been no. There are lots of reasons not to like protectionism, but there's no story about how it causes recessions. But protectionism where nobody knows what it's going to be, where nobody knows what the tariff rates are going to be next year, that could cause a recession. So we may have the first real sort of tariff-induced recession that I'm aware of in history, like now.
That'll give us something to keep an eye on over the next
Yeah,
year and more. I'm going to change topics a little bit. We started a little bit to talk about uh, power in the economy. Who has it?
yeah.
Who doesn't? It's something that you've explored in your book, Conscience of a Liberal. You wrote something that I really like. The New Deal did more than create a middle class society. It also brought America closer to its democratic ideals by giving working Americans real political power and ending the dominant position of the wealthy elite. What, particularly in the environment we're in today, what do you think policymakers should be thinking about in terms of what we can do to bring that New Deal power lens both to this moment and to a moment where we would have the ability to set the rules to put our country on a better course?
Well, there are two ends to that. One is just giving ordinary working or middle class people effective vehicles to exert political influence, and that, of course, we have the vote. Well, there's no of course about that, but in principle, at least we have votes. But I don't think uh, I don't think we really realized how much a strong union movement contributed towards making democracy work better. You can say, well, why isn't the individual right to vote enough? And the answer is, look, there's collective action problems. Politics is completely um, pervasive of uh, things that would be good if everybody did them, but maybe no individual incentive. So organizing politically is always hard, and unions are a big force in that, or were, and to some extent still are, but much less than they used to be. And that's really important. We are a less democratic country because, in practice, because we don't have workers organized. That's one end of it, and there may be other ways. Although I have to admit that I'm not all that creative. I think the success of unions in really making America more American, and in the post-war generation, is something that we have never managed to find other routes to do. Then, on the other hand, there's the question of the influence of malefactors of great wealth, the influence of vast wealth. And you don't have to get too much into current events to say, well, we can really see that. It's actually, I have to say, going back now, it looks like the plutocrats of the Gilded Age, by contemporary standards, were remarkable in their restraint and discretion. They didn't try to buy influence as openly as the plutocrats of today do. So now there are things you can do. I mean, it's funny that our great grandfathers were much more open than we are in saying that one of the purposes of progressive taxation is to actually limit extreme wealth, and not simply because it's more money to serve the common people, but because extreme wealth distorts democracy. Woodrow Wilson was much more willing to say things that would be regarded as extremely radical leftism now. Um, so you would really, to reclaim who we are as a nation are supposed to be, you need to work on both those ends. You need to try to empower uh, basically working Americans, ordinary workers, and their to have a role, and maybe more. Maybe there are other things besides unions, but that's the sort of obvious route. And then you also need to try both, with rules about money and politics, but also perhaps, if we can eventually, constrain policy that limits the accumulation of enormous fortunes, that also limits that distortion. Because we really are in a situation now where it's all of the warnings about, well, as FDR would have said, the power of organized money seem far more acute now than they ever did in the past.
Um, mentioned sort of ideas that once were sort of acceptable to say in polite company that seem more radical now. This is sort of the business of Roosevelt, right? To think big about how we can solve these questions of the maldistribution of power in the economy and do them at a structural level, and how to make ideas about that part of the common sense.
Yeah,
Um, you've talked about how that is part of what happened with the New Deal, that New Deal institutions that were at first considered novel and radical by sort of the Eisenhower presidency had become
yeah.
the normal part of American life. Um, how did that happen in your view? That change in the common sense, and what made them so enduring, and what lessons can we find for today about how to reorient what seems impossible and what seems a normal part of life.
One of the things that strikes me when I look at history, both of economic institutions and of economic ideas, is that lots of things seem radical and scary until people have had a chance to experience them. So, I mean, there's the famous Nancy Pelosi quote, often out of context, where she said that for people to really understand the Affordable Care Act, we have to pass it. And it wasn't like we're going to pull one over on people. It was that uh, as long as it was merely a theoretical thing, as long as it was something in prospect, it was possible to tell scare stories about death panels and just say, this is, what will this do? And then after a few years, it becomes part of the fabric of life. And by the time there was actually became fairly close to losing it, people were outraged because that the even imperfect as it is, Obamacare is a terrifically important safety net for many people. You see that on a much larger scale in the New Deal changes. So if you go back when FDR did his really stem-winding address in 1936 about the "I welcome their hatred" thing. The thing that was really uh, the flashpoint that was widely portrayed on one side of the political spectrum as an outrageous step that would destroy the market economy was actually not Social Security but unemployment insurance. It was like, oh my God, you're going to actually pay people when they don't have jobs, and that it turned out that hey, that's okay. We in fact, it's a really sometimes, I mean, with unemployment insurance was the most important thing that got us through COVID with minimal hardship. There are people, there's always people who want to do away with these safety net programs, but things that can be made to sound ominous and radical when no one has actually experienced them can, after a few years, become part of the landscape. And in some ways, the New Deal was, first got us through the Great Depression, then got us through the war. And by the time the war was over, we had become a very different country, and I would say a much better country in which people accepted that, yeah, we have a kind of public responsibility to limit extreme inequality, to limit extreme hardship.
Um, I want to close us out with a note that you struck in your final New York Times column last December. It was a tough one. You wrote, quote, optimism has been replaced by anger and resentment, and that the public no longer has faith that the people running things know what they're doing or or what we can assume that they, oh, sorry, or that we can assume that they're being honest.
Yeah.
I think that applies to government. It also applies to a lot of institutions across the board. So here is my question for you. What do you think it will take to rebuild trust in public institutions? And also, on a more personal level, how do you find the hope that we can make it there from here?
Well, there's nothing like actually doing good to build trust. I mean, if we can find our way past the current turmoil, I think that there's an underlying reservoir of optimism still in America. And if we can get our way past this, whatever, all of these things that led us to this rather scary moment, that a few years of good governance can actually do wonders. I mean, I'm older than a lot than you are, and that's certainly older than a lot of the people I deal with. But I remember the 1990s, and although there are many imperfections and lots of things, it's hard to remember just how positive people were feeling about America by the end of that decade. And that was thrown away through a variety of bad decisions, but there's still, but we, it's not that distant, it's not that inconceivable. I would think that the way forward is to get people in power who really do try to use it for good, get good programs, get good policy, get decent people. There's a lot of strengths in America, and this atmosphere of distrust and feeling that everyone is out to get you or is self-serving, that will go away fairly quickly if it's demonstrably not true. Um, Now, personal, I mean, I'm terrified. I'm not giving up, but you can see a lot of the things that we read about in the history books about how societies go wrong are no longer abstract. We can see them. We can see those emotions. We can see those forces out there. But the truth is that a better environment is actually people become more generous, more positive when things are going okay, and we really don't want to have a situation where there's kind of zero sum. I've got mine. I don't want anybody else to get it. Thinking is validated by experience. So try to make things work is how we go from here.
I can tell you one of the things that gives me hope, Paul, is that in a moment where we are watching some institutions um, capitulate and
Yeah.
fold in a way that is really disheartening, we also have some voices that are getting louder, not softer. And I think one of them is yours. So I want to say how appreciative I know I am personally, and how excited I know the Institute is generally to have you on as a senior fellow, in part because I really do think you are a voice out there that's making sense of what's happening, that's helping us put into a context that we can understand the sort of flood of news that we are experiencing. And again, to demonstrate what it looks like to be a consistent voice with good analysis and moral clarity about what's happening now, and also who we have been in the past and who we could be again. So we really appreciate your work, and we really appreciate you taking the time to chat today.
Well, thank you. And I'm glad to be on board.
Excellent. Thanks so much.